Good afternoon. And I say that with some trepidation because our audience is national and international. So good morning to some of you and good evening to some of you. I'm Jim Grossman. I'm the executive director of the American Historical Association. And this is an initial experiment in something that we are likely to call history behind the headlines. The AHA considers historical context and perspective essential to decision-making in public culture, and especially in all aspects of public policy. The AHA is a membership-supported organization. Just a reminder, one has to say these things. Anybody who watches public television and listens to public radio is ready for this. If you'd like to become a member and support this type of content, membership links are located in the chat on Zoom and in the comments on Facebook Live. And I want to give an especially grateful thank you to History Channel for their generous sponsorship of this webinar. So let's get started. It's an honor to introduce today's panelists, Annette Gordon-Reed, Professor of Law and History at Harvard University, and David Blight, Professor of History and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. Professors Gordon-Reed and Blight are Pulitzer Prize winning historians, and they've won lots of other prizes as well, who have written and spoken frequently and insightfully on issues relating to monuments, history, memory, and our nation's continuing failure to fully confront the implications of its own history. Professor Gordon-Reed's most recent book, co-authored with Peter Onuf, is Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. Professor Blight's is Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. Both of these scholars are notable for their insistence that people and the way we remember and honor those people are complicated, whether we're thinking about Frederick Douglass or Thomas Jefferson. We're going to have roughly 35 minutes of moderated discussion, after which there will be questions from the audience. And I apologize in advance that given the number of people, we will not be able to address probably even most of the questions that we get. We will do our best. So let's get started. And let's start with the meaning and the implications of removing Confederate statues from our public landscape, which I know both of you, David and Annette, have discussed frequently and in all sorts of venues. This is not a new issue, but something is clearly different this time around. So let's start with what's different and why. And Annette, you referred to what's happening now as a, quote, great awakening. And waking up is always a good place to start. So why don't we start there?
Well, I think it's different this time. And I don't know a precise reason, but I have some theories. Obviously, the killing of George Floyd provoked a lot of soul searching on the part of people. The nature of the video, the stark nature of the video, actually sort of captured people's attention in a way that hasn't happened before. It could be because we're in the middle of a pandemic and people have been cloistered and have been told to, for the basis of the community, people were actually doing something that made them think about other people, that they had to think about other people. So I have a feeling that that may have contributed to it as well. The fact that people could focus on it and the fact that we are engaged in a typically not something that Americans do or haven't done recently in a sort of communal fashion. Looking at this, people said something had to happen, that it struck people viscerally in the way that the killings of other people have not. I mean, that is always, people were concerned about Trayvon Martin and so forth. But I think the social circumstances in which this happened, and historians always look to this, the context is different. And that made a difference in the way people have responded to it, I think.
So what's interesting then is, so we have the statues being toppled. We have the statues being toppled in the context in it that you just talked about. these statues are part of a story and they tell stories.
Mhm.
So one thing I'm curious about is, and maybe David, you can speak to this, is this the death of the lost cause?
Probably not, but we can hope. I try to see this moment now, and again, no one should predict anything right now in this climate, and especially us historians. But it really is a culmination now of about a 150-year counterattack on the lost cause ideology. The lost cause ideology takes form right after the war, especially in the 1870s and 1880s. The Confederate monuments came out of a bit later period in that, during the Jim Crow era, when the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the United Confederate Veterans took hold of that process. But it was an ideology, and it was a racial ideology, and it was an ideology of white supremacy. And it became not a story of loss at all. It became a victory narrative, and the victory was over Reconstruction. But the attack back on the lost cause, led by Frederick Douglass and many others, is 150 years old. As early as 1871, right after Lee died. Lee died in 1870. And shortly after that, it was in early 71, Douglass wrote a piece in which he said he was sick and tired, quote, of the nauseating flatteries of Robert E. Lee. And he wondered why the person who had killed the most Union soldiers, who had killed the most Americans to divide the country, was getting all the accolades. So this is an old set of arguments. However, we obviously now have a different politics. If it hadn't been for the massive protests in the streets this past month, massive numbers of people in the streets, I doubt police forces of various kinds would have allowed people to tear down monuments as they have. Police have not always, but by and large, have been letting this happen. So there is a politics in the streets that is bringing this about. And I guess I would just add right now, and I don't have any data on this, but Trumpism, let's just be honest. The nature of our politics the last 3.5, 4 years is out there in the streets too. Now, is everybody demanding a Confederate monument be removed or attacking a Confederate monument or even other kinds of monuments? Are they always thinking about Trump? Probably not. But Trump has developed a toxic kind of politics that is now bringing out all kinds of resistance that we had not earlier seen. And it is directly related to police killings, but it's also, I think, related to a bursting out of rage against Trumpism. I just hope this can be harnessed somehow into something called voting.
That was my next question, was the harnessing, because you've talked here about how the politics affects what happens in the streets. And right before that, Annette framed the politics and what's happening in the streets in essence as a larger context that ties together. So I'm curious. So the politics affects what happens in the streets, and you've explained how that happens. I wonder if either or both of you could talk about how what happens in the streets affects the politics. So we pull down a whole bunch of monuments. So what?
Well, it's an interesting question. We were talking about this before. We had this moment where you have huge numbers of people are finally beginning to look to the question of policing in America, particularly policing at the African-American community, and voicing support for Black Lives Matter. And then the focus shifts to statues. And for me, there's a little bit of frustration. It's not that I don't think that monuments and statues are important, but it's way more important to get the issue of police reform, voter suppression, those kinds of things on the front burner. And we have fallen into battles about culture, the sort of culture war things that deflect from real economic, social kinds of issues that brought people out in the streets to begin with. I mean, people are being killed. African Americans feel threatened by police. This is something that has been going on for decades. And everybody can tell you a story. Many Black people can tell you stories about people that they knew they know of who went into police stations and didn't come out, people who had encounters with police that ended in death for minor things, that kind of issue that brought people out. I want to talk about monuments, and I think they're important, but I don't want us to get away from those kinds of central issues. What's going to happen November 3rd, with the election, what voter suppression, all those kinds of things are the things that I think I really primarily like to be focused on. So there's a way that we have this moment, but the moment it can sort of move, we can lose the momentum on that if we focus too much on the wrong things.
Well,
as important as they are,
I think it's a powerful argument in that, and one of the ways it manifests is that it is easier to oppose a monument than it is to figure out a vast new social policy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things again, we're historians, we like evidence and all of that. But, one of the things I wish people would do now is actually go read the Policing and Justice Act. This is the House bill. There's a lot in that. That is, it's not everything, but it's a new kind of civil rights act. It even has a federal anti-lynching law in it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot in that act. And, that's how this has to get converted, hopefully, harnessed into a new politics, a new civil rights regime of some sort. However, what's interesting about the monuments is we do have a tipping point here, and we see these throughout history. When we reach a point where somehow people who would have really defended Confederate monuments a year ago, they can't quite do it now.
Yeah.
Even Republicans in the Senate are saying, well, yeah, maybe those military bases, maybe that is not wasn't such a good idea after all. So there's a tipping point here that we weren't at even a year ago. And
absolutely.
We weren't at in the summer of 2015 when so much of this began after the Charleston massacre. Back then it was about taking a Confederate flag down, and a few monuments were under duress. Now it's everything Confederate.
Everybody.
It's everything Confederate.
Or Grant.
Well, yeah. Well, this is the, every moment, like every tipping point has excess.
Yeah.
It is. It's going to have excesses. And, and everybody's moaning right now. Well, how could you take down a Grant statue? He was bequeathed one slave, and he freed that slave, and so on and so on and so on. He saved the Union. He was the general. Okay, right. There are going to be excesses, and we have to be able to stand up, and say, you know what, toppling that one, that's wrong.
That's wrong. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Topple that one. Yeah. Okay. I'm with you.
So if you're
gotta make choices,
you do make and we've said before, you make choices every single day. We do that all the time, and the point is how it takes place, the kind of discussion that takes place about it. But some will stay and some will go.
So
that's just the way it is.
How would all three of us have talked about this, about this, that there's not an inevitable slippery slope, that this is a ridiculous argument. So, Annette, since you've won you've written prize-winning work about Jefferson, about the founders in general, this is what's constantly brought up by the people who say this is inevitably going to, all the icons will be smashed. What are the criteria that you can imagine thinking about when you say, no, there's judgment here?
Well, the criteria, there are lots of them, but the one that I've always given is distinguishing the Confederates from the founders, is that the founders created the country and the Confederates tried to destroy the country. I think that's a pretty good bright line rule. And when you lose a war, you don't usually get to continue glorifying yourself by putting up statues in public places, or, sort of mocking the people who defeated you, that the Confederates were vanquished. There's no reason for them to be there. The Confederacy was a branch. If we think of the country as a river, it was sort of a branch that went off to nowhere. There's nothing that they contribute to us that you couldn't get from some other place. And it's not what they stood for. Their values are not values that we stand for. African chattel slavery, the inferiority, they specifically repudiated Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Alexander Stephens did. So we can do without them. The founders are different because they founded the country. I mean, it's sort of hard for me to think of living in a place without telling the story or actually commemorating, not celebrating. I mean, you think of what a statue is about. It's not, I mean, to me, it's not about, oh, this was the greatest, this was a god, this is the greatest person who ever lived, whatever. It's about recognizing this person did something important. And I think founding the United States, I mean, there's some people who don't think that was a good idea, but if you think it was a good idea, that these people did that and you see them. And the important thing is to see them in all of their complexity, to see them in all aspects. So you have Jefferson, you have Washington, but you mentioned that they were slave owners. You mentioned that they bought and sold people. You mentioned those kinds of things. You mentioned the good with the bad. And we're, to my mind, stuck with these people who created the country. The Confederacy, that's nothing. I mean, that's not a story that continues in any kind of way. We have made use of the things that Jefferson, in particular, ideals, put forth. And whether, you know, like in some religious belief that we think you had to be in your heart, are you sincere, those ideas have been useful. And so that's the distinction that I would make. And I understand that people say, well, he owned slaves and so therefore they should go. But I mean, that's like, you know, you can't redo your parentage. You can't stop and pretend that those people did not exist and that they didn't do something that most of us think was a positive thing, but you got to tell the whole story about them. When you tell the whole, it creates some, I think, to my mind, a much more mature attitude about history and historical figures. They're not about our best friends. You know, they're not about the people that we want to hang out with or whatever. These are the people who did things that we have to know about. And in order to understand who we are and to do things differently, take the best of what they gave, reject the things that were bad. But I just think it's hiding your head in the sand if you pretend that they didn't do anything that we think is positive, or that the negative things automatically outweigh those. We have to talk about both of them.
Annette, can I ask you a question of a
Sure.
sort? Not that you have to answer for everyone who studies the founders by any means. I mean, actually, first of all, I would say it's so true to focus. If we can help the public focus their minds on just what the Confederacy was. It was an insurgent revolution to create a slaveholders' republic. And I would just say to people, we don't want to name too many books here, but if you read something like Stephanie McCurry's most recent book called Confederate Reckoning, if you have any kind of progressive view of the United States and you actually believe in our pluralism and you believe in equality, you can't read that book without a tremendous sigh of relief that the Confederacy didn't win.
Yeah.
And it's really important to understand that. Something only lasted 4 years, but it's still here.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, what I was going to say too, and then I'll let you ask your question.
Sure.
It's you let them off the hook. Yeah. If you put them, and that's, they would like nothing more than to be to lumped in with Washington and Jefferson. We're just like those people. No. No,
that
that's
was their
not.
Claim. They believed they were the vessel of the American Revolution, resisting centralized authority and all that. Was a central tenet of the Lost Cause, and it's still out there in a lot of conservative.
No, a lot of people believe that, but they never quote Stevens. They never look at the Constitution. Right. They don't look at the documents that framed that government and framed their society. So they're slave owners and they were racist, and they may have been like Jefferson and Washington in that sense. Yeah. But the documents that they set for their nation don't comport with anything that we say we believe. We could take the Constitution transformed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We could take the Declaration and we can make a new society. We can't take the Cornerstone speech. We can't take the Constitution and the secession. We can't do anything with that and continue in peace in this country.
Or Jefferson Davis's 1,200-page memoir.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes.
On every page, it defends the existence of slavery because Africans were savages. But here's the quick question.
Okay.
We're living a moment right now when there are a lot of people, and I'll just name it, the 1619 Project, suggested that Americans ought to reconsider what the founding is, that the founding is really when slaves arrived, and not the creation of the Republic out of the American Revolution and the writing of the U.S. Constitution. So, and maybe that, that kind of set of assumptions was out there anyway. I'm not just blaming the 1619 Project. But there are a lot of people who say, the founding was all racist anyway. It was all in the service of slavery. So why not get rid of Jefferson?
Well,
I don't believe that necessarily.
I know, but I mean, I don't, it's hard to respond to that question because in the first place, if you're going to pick something other than 1776 as the founding, you might pick of the British founding, you might pick 1607, you might pick when Englishmen rolled up on the North American continent, said, we've discovered it, and began to push indigenous people off the land. So that's a point. Certainly 1619 is a point, but that was the English Empire. That was a part of the English Empire. There's no United States of America at that point. And as historians, we can't treat that as if those moments put forth some sort of inevitable outcome that we end up at 1776 and then we end up with me sitting in my apartment here now. Anything could have happened at that point. So I think the founding was racist. I mean, certainly the Constitution protected slavery, and we can argue with Sean Wilentz about that. Protected slavery. We should have had Sean here.
I think he's watching today, though.
What?
I think he's watching.
He might be. Hi, Sean. It protected slavery. It protected slavery, but it also unleashed an anti-slavery movement. The revolution did. And what that wasn't inevitable either. What happened from that wasn't inevitable, but it did. The fact is, African-American people, other people said, wait a minute, this applies to us as well. And that has been the basis for a struggle up until now. It's not, that's real. It's as real as, it's as real as the founding is many things. It's not any one thing. And it's what you make of it. And people made different things of it.
So we're still here focusing on the East Coast, which we do, unfortunately.
Yes, unfortunately.
And on the English. What happens if you shift the angle of vision? There are issues over the statues in the Capitol. And it's easy to identify the either 11 or 12. I got into an argument with a reporter, former Confederate soldiers in the Capitol, whether it's 11 or 12. But there's also Father Sarah.
Yeah.
And Father Sarah never donned a Confederate uniform. Father Sarah never took up arms against anything called the United States of America, but he did some pretty bad things to people who are the ancestors of Americans. What do we do when we think about Father Sarah in the Capitol?
Well, David, you want to try that one?
Well, we're going to have to come up with some kind of principles, I suspect, that we apply to these things. Every case is not identical. We seem to have a developing set of principles about the Confederacy.
Yeah.
Insurgency to destroy the United States, treason, if you like. What are they doing inside the U.S. Capitol when they tried to?
I know, but that's crazy.
Yeah, it'd be like putting up a statue in the U.S. Capitol of the general who commanded the burning of Washington in the War of 1812 or something. Folks. Father Sarah and what happened to Native Americans in California. We need another set of principles here about just how much that offends Americans broadly, not just Native Americans, how much that is inconsistent with values and our mission as a pluralistic society today. I think we may need some kind of commission within the Congress, and maybe not just congressmen, hopefully not just congressmen.
No, the American Historical Association needs to be part of that commission, David.
I agree with you.
Yes.
And you might get 500 volunteers off this webinar, who knows?
Yeah.
But to come up with some criteria, because otherwise this is going to be willy-nilly.
Yeah.
And even if somebody passed a rule that you revisit these things every 25 years or something, which I guess has been considered, it's still
Oh, it
gonna.
hasn't been considered. That was just my suggestion.
Oh, okay. Well,
It was only my suggestion. No one
you
else.
have a lot of power, Jim. So that
Yeah,
means
you could do that. You could make it. You could make it happen. No, yeah.
You can't do this by popular referendum. Look what Mississippi just found out. They had a referendum on that state flag about 10 years ago, and they decided to keep it by 75%. Right now, the politics are such that they just got rid of it.
Yeah, got rid of it.
Yeah.
Which people thought would never happen. It's hard to imagine happen.
A lot of things are happening right now that many of us thought would never happen. I mean, nobody in my field who studied this for most of their lives ever really thought that Lee would be gone from Monument Avenue in Richmond, or a bunch of other things, but he's going to be gone.
Yeah.
So, Father, you're right. Father Sarah didn't wear a uniform, wasn't a Confederate, wasn't a military, didn't take up arms against the United States, but he's slaughtered.
Oh, and what about the Union soldiers who, after finishing off the Confederates, turned west? So that they're a complicated subject as well. But the point is to have these kinds of discussions. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I think a lot of it has, my response to this, maybe yours too, David, you and Jim, you can ask yourself, is that we're historians and we deal in the past all the time. And we know all the terrible things that people do and have always done in the past, in the present, and will do in the future.
It's a given.
It's a given. It's human. It's given. And
you can't purify your history. You can't purify the past.
Yeah.
And so, I think the point you've just made, Annette, is so crucial because I actually saw it happen last week in my own neighborhood. I live 4 blocks from the Emancipation Memorial, the Freedmen's Memorial, and one of the issues there is the difference between how we as historians think about that statue and how people as parents think about that statue.
Yes,
what does it mean to be a parent and walk past that statue with your 9-year-old? How do you explain it? And I'm curious. But what's happening in that park is exactly what you just described. People discussing, it's become a way in which there's civic culture happening.
Yeah.
Which is how it should be. But what do you say to people who, all these monuments around the country are, in a sense, role models? And what do you say to high school teachers, to parents? How do you explain this whole controversy and what it means to younger people?
David, you've written about this.
Oh, I thought he was asking you first.
Either one of you.
It doesn't matter. I'm happy to take that on. I've been all too public about this, I guess, but I personally hope that the Freedmen's Memorial, as it's often called, or sometimes it's called the Emancipation Group, it goes by different names. I personally hope that statue survives. I agree and have said so that the imagery today is certainly racist. The kneeling slave, the godlike, very Christian, godlike Lincoln with his hand outreached, giving emancipation. And of course, forever people can debate whether the kneeling slave is rising, breaking his own chains and all of that. I don't even want to get into that. That's always been debated. But one of the important things about that particular monument is, first of all, it is about Black freedom. It was created by and large by Black people. $20,000 raised by African Americans, the first $5, as people are happily learning, by Charlotte Scott, a former slave woman from Missouri, who for the rest of her life was known as the woman who created the Freedmen's Memorial. It was a huge event in DC the day it was unveiled. It's a huge classic DC Black parade with bands and fraternal orders and all the rest. Master of Ceremonies was John Mercer Langston, the Dean of the Howard Law School. Douglas was Orator of the Day, and A.M.E. Bishop gave the opening. So, but I think that ground, in the rarest of cases, are there monuments rendered important by a speech at its unveiling. Most unveiling speeches are either forgettable or repulsive. In this case, Douglas gave the second greatest speech of his life, the first being the 4th of July speech. But his Freedmen's Memorial speech, all 13 pages of it, was a masterpiece.
Yeah, it
In the
is.
first part, he took on Lincoln directly, dead honestly. And he said Abraham Lincoln was a white man's president. Abraham Lincoln, in his prejudices, assumptions, was a white man. He was not our president, meaning our black people's president. And then came that famous line, "My white fellow citizens, you are Abraham Lincoln's children. I and my people are his stepchildren." Incredible metaphor. Stepchildren by adoption, by necessity and circumstance. And then in the middle of that speech comes a pause, and he shifts. He shifts not to celebrating Lincoln, but he says with a refrain 3 times, under his rule and in due time, under his rule and in due time, Lincoln found the method, the way to create the policy by which we became free. It honors Lincoln's essential kind of political pragmatism. At the same time, Douglas had been dead honest about what most black folks had thought of Lincoln in the first year and a half or more of the war, including Douglas. And last point, that speech is really directed at the audience in the first 2 rows, because he had President Grant, members of the cabinet, justices of the Supreme Court, members of the House and the Senate, the entire government sat in front of him. And Douglas is telling them, you're losing Reconstruction. Reconstruction is falling apart.
David, let
you don't act now, you'll never have another chance. I'm sorry, I went on too long about the speech, but I do know the imagery of that monument is offensive to many people, but not all people. And I'm now in dialogue on email, more than I want to be, but with people who live in that neighborhood, African Americans who live in that neighborhood, who are of different opinions about this.
Yeah.
It may be breaking down generationally, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how people respond to that particular image, which is such a 19th century image.
Well, for me, this is what I disagree with David on. I think the statue should probably, I know museums hate it when they say it should be put in a museum. They're like, we're going to keep this.
Yeah, where are they going to put it? Right.
Where are they going to put it? I think the National Museum of African American History would be a wonderful place to put it, with Douglas's speech and everything put into context. The difficulty, I'm impressed by the fact that this was Black people who raised the money for this, but they didn't get the opportunity to say what the image should be. And
That's
it's
true.
not a surprise that the image would be that of a white savior.
And a kneeling slave.
A kneeling slave. I mean, I'm not one of those people who says Abraham Lincoln he got shot in the back of the head. He was martyred for coming up with that policy and having people think that he was creating Black citizenship. So he sacrificed all. So I'm not one of those people, put Lincoln in a corner. But African American men bled and died for freedom. As soldiers, African American men, women, and children, ran away from left the plantation into the plantation system. Black people brought about their freedom, contributed to bring about their freedom. And the idea that they would raise money, give it to whites, and their answer would be a white savior motive. And you said this is the 19th century. It's not a 19th century thing. If we want to talk about race, we can talk about today. The image of the white savior, film, movies, everywhere. This notion that you can't have Blacks and whites can't exist equally. Not a statue with them standing, with the person standing next to him. Mm-hmm. Maybe not shaking hands, that might have been too much, maybe a gesture towards it, for their joint effort to end slavery. So this is, I said before about the Confederacy, this thing sort of going off into nowhere. The notion of the white savior exists today. And people who are whites, who see themselves as progressive and are allies, still have an easier time dealing with us when you are in a position of superiority. That's a comfort, that level. Even if you're doing something good, it has to be whites here, Blacks down there. And so I think seeing that image is a similar feeling that I felt going along Central Park West with TR. Yeah. With the Native American and the Black person on either side. I don't have a problem with it. If they could just sort of get so welder to separate those two people off and just have TR on the horse, that would be fine. But it's sending a message. And if that message were something, the emancipation message, if that was something that had gone, if the notion of the white savior did not exist today, then I might have a different view. But the 19th century is still present here in the 21st century. And so I wouldn't want my kid walking past that. And I felt the same way taking my kids into the American Museum of Natural History to explain that statue. What is that saying about who you are and who you have been?
And
Well, let me just add here that, well, my proposal is to build an additional emancipation monument next to the Freedmen's Memorial. And it was actually Douglas's suggestion, which we only recently had verified by the intrepid research of Scott Sandage and John White, who found the clippings in the past.
Oh, yeah.
In the past week, to my knowledge, of Douglas. 5 days after that unveiling in the National Republican, a newspaper in DC, Douglas said he didn't like that kneeling slave. He wanted a standing, strong image of emancipation. And he himself suggested an additional monument should be put there.
Yeah.
I guess my point of view on this is, why not have both? What incredible teaching one can do to show, because how many people are going to really see this in a museum? You're right. If it's in a good space in the African American Museum, it may indeed be seen by a lot of people, because a lot of people go there.
A lot of people.
Why not have that juxtaposition there that shows the then and the now, the past and the present, and celebrate Douglas's speech as well? Why not a Douglas statue there?
So would that be your solution? Say, I mean, let's extend this problem. I started off by saying what's wonderful about the work that both of you do is that the two of you present historical figures as complicated people.
Yes.
So here's two complicated people, General Sheridan, Philip Sheridan, and General Oliver Otis Howard. Both heroic figures in terms of their role in the Civil War, both somewhat less heroic in terms of their role in killing and removing Native Americans after the Civil War. So, David, your solution would be anytime we have a statue of Phil Sheridan, we put another statue next to it that somehow commemorates or helps us to remember the other things. How do we deal with the complexity? People live 5, 6, 7 decades. How do you deal with the complexities of their lives?
It's
first
tough.
of all, I'm not sure Phil Sheridan merits that kind of worry and concern. There are Sheridan monuments, clearly. There's a Sheridan Square in DC, and I think there's one in New York as well.
There's one in New York, I think he said.
Yeah, down in the Village, isn't it? So, yeah, and most Americans don't even know who Oliver Otis Howard was unless they know the name Howard University, I suppose. But, this is a mess. It's complicated. It always is going to be. But I do think people need a reminder that you just can't purify the past and you can't purify your memory. You're going to have to make choices about these things. And some monuments, some memorials are worthy of keeping, not just because of what we can learn from them, but because of the circumstances of their creation. And some are not. And we're going to have to come up, not that Yale is a paragon for this, but when Yale had to consider getting rid of the name of John C. Calhoun on a residential college here, President Salve and the administration created a committee. I was on the committee to try to come up with principles that you could actually follow, by which a university, at least, we're not talking about a nation or a company now or a city, a university might rename something. And we did. We did a lot of research. In fact, we called in Annette Gordon-Reed as an advisor on it, among others. And we came up with these principles by which the administration could then put Calhoun through those principles. And in the end, they said, okay, we're going to remove that one. Now, we're going to have to think in these terms, whether it's monuments in Congress, monuments on a public square, or elsewhere.
School name.
Rather than
School name,
just
yeah.
willy-nilly,
School name.
are the politics such right now that that has to come down? And do we wait for a new politics for that one to come down? Or do we actually have some kind of principles? Otherwise, the mob will take the monuments away when the mob can get away with it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in any event, the notion of taking it down without deliberation from other people is problematic. Now, that's the law professor, lawyer in me saying that, you know, that's problematic because
we believe in deliberation and knowledge.
They would believe in that because they'll take down statues of people that I admire, and you know, it's just not. That's not the way to go. That isn't something that I would encourage.
Well, that goes back to what you earlier said, Annette, about civic culture. That in fact, maybe that's one of the maybe one value of monuments is that if we say not only principles, but process.
Yes.
That every generation, every 25 years, we will look at all of the namings in some kind of civic process.
And I said that's very Jeffersonian. The earth belongs to the living. That every generation of people should sit down, and there should be a discussion about, do we agree with this, and is this what we wish for? It's not a simple. That won't necessarily solve all the problems, but you know, we have to have discussions about this, and they have, I think, a larger benefit, because then we see what our values are, our points of commonality, where we disagree, but not talking about it. I mean, having a large conversation about this, I think it would be a mistake.
And we should listen to young people. Well, let's face it. I mean, that may seem like a cliche. We should be listening to young people right now, what they think about all this, especially when they get themselves informed.
Yeah, well.
So I'm looking at the questions. We have a lot of questions. I'm not going to be able to ask all of them. Well, I'm just going to pull some out randomly, not quite randomly. Someone has suggested that maybe, especially given that we're supposedly a nation with democratic values, maybe we shouldn't build memorials of people. Maybe our memorials should not have people.
I was just about to say, maybe monuments are a thing of the past. Memorials with statues, we don't seem to do them very well. No, very few new statues that I look at am I impressed. Some people have done them well. Maybe that could be it. Maybe, you know, that time for that is gone.
Emancipation is not a person. It's an epic historical process. It's a pivot of American history. You know, it is the greatest result of the Civil War, but it's not a single person by any means. You know, nor are things like industrialization or.
But it still doesn't do. It doesn't answer the question about what do we do with the ones that are already there.
Yeah.
Because there are people, members of our community, who admire, who like the statues of people, who find something meaningful about it. So that maybe not, you know, the question suggests that maybe we shouldn't be building more, but it still doesn't answer the question of what are we going to do about the ones that are there? How do we decide who stays and who goes?
Well, it is a fascinating thing to ask. And I've taught a bunch of courses and seminars on memory and memorials. When you ask the question, so what memorial have you ever visited that really worked for you? What memorial have you ever visited that made you weep? What monument did you ever visit that offended you? You know, and it's you know, we all will have perhaps different answers to that.
Yeah.
Some people are appalled by, you know, triumphal 19th century equestrian statues, which you know, they fit their age. Some people love modernist visions of something complicated, some don't. But what monument moves you? What monument doesn't? You know, it's kind of worth asking people. You know, the Vietnam Memorial, not everyone, but most people today, there is a consensus about that design that has been adopted almost as a place of healing, a place of mourning, a place of commemoration. And
it was controversial.
Oh,
at the beginning, people hated it at first.
Oh, well, the Reagan administration didn't want to put it.
Because they wanted something triumphal, something that was with a, you know, had some oomph to it. And in fact, she created something that's deeply moving and personal to people of all, you know, of all types.
and it has been modeled
Yeah.
elsewhere as a way of memorializing at least death in war.
Mhm.
But it's worth asking, if commissions get created or whatever, what memorials actually work for people
Mhm.
and what don't. One of the things I've already recommended publicly, I don't know if it'll happen, but the Biden campaign, and I'll just say it, the Biden campaign should get out ahead of this issue. If the Confederate landscape is coming down and the lost cause is in deep trouble, I'm not saying we're going to eliminate it ideologically, but if the lost cause in the Confederate landscape is coming down, what might replace it? Why doesn't the Biden administration bring together a bunch of people and start thinking about that? In fact, the aforementioned Sean Wilentz on an email to me yesterday said we need to advocate a marble New Deal. Now, I don't know that it should be called
Marble New Deal.
I don't know if that would work right now, but why not? Get out ahead of this issue. Say that there's going to be a national project that could also, of course, become local. I mean, most monuments are local. If you think about it, they were created by somebody in that town. To rethink this idea of memorialization, especially about subjects like emancipation.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for Infrastructure Week, but that's
I know.
me.
So, but the monuments, when you say they're local chronologically as well as spatially. And David, when you say, what are the monuments that make you cry? What are the monuments that inspire you? Doesn't that change over time?
Yes. And one has to usually know the story the monument represents.
But most people don't, right? Most people,
True.
you walk past a monument and your kid says, "Who's that?" Or
you don't know who they are.
Yeah. So
and you say Phil Sheridan. Now what are you going to do, Dad?
Well, what do we do with that as historians, knowing that people's values change over time? And to go back again to, in some ways, how Annette started, that the social and political needs and conflicts in the country change over time.
Well, my own favorite example of that question, Jim, is the Shaw Memorial in Boston, the Shaw 54th Massachusetts Memorial. That is Augustus St. Gaudens's masterpiece. That's the bas-relief on Boston Common across from the state capitol in a very public place, a bus stop. But that monument tells a narrative. It tells a story. It tells a deeply moving story of what Black men had to do. They had to go die in war to be acknowledged as men. And and furthermore, it's an artistic masterpiece. It's a bas-relief like nothing else I don't think any American artist has ever created. Once people learn that story, that monument moves them still. Not just because there was a movie made about the 54th, but they got to know the story. They got to know what it represents. And it is about suffering. It is about blood sacrifice in war. There are ways that can grab our emotions that other kinds of stories don't. But monuments do need to tell a story if they're really good.
And the ones that we are upset about are the ones that tell stories that are painful, in another way. It's not a story of, I talked before about the values that we have, a value of suffering and redemption, those kinds of things, versus the white man's burden, or a white a manifest destiny or white supremacy, which some of these monuments are. That's the story that they're telling.
And one of our questions, and that has actually, one of our questioners has actually asked what the two of you think about, again, instead of doing individual monuments is, and maybe this goes back to Sean's Marble New Deal, commissioning artists to create monuments exactly to what you just described, Annette. Monuments to values, monuments to emotions, monuments to the way we feel about our environment. Would that be, in a sense, I hate to call it a solution. I mean, our colleague Robin Kelly has suggested that all military monuments be wiped off the face of the earth. and that would be the statement of values that we would like to see. But these monuments do state our values. So should we be more explicit about that and say, let's put up monuments about our values instead of people?
Well, I mean, the problem is that the monuments that were put up were monuments to values because the people supposedly exhibited values that the people admired. There's a statue of Jefferson in front of the journalism school at Columbia. It's not about him being a slave owner. It's not even about the Declaration, but it's about the notion of freedom of the press. And it's what, that's what the people who put the statues up, typically they're not putting people up. Let's put Joe up, Joe for no reason up. It's somebody that they think embodies a particular value. So I think that's always or TR, courage, when he's by himself, that monument was the value of white supremacy, clearly. So yeah, I mean, we should do that, but I think that's what's been going on all along. The question is, those are not values that some of those values aren't values that are serving us very well at all.
Well, I love that question though, and I have great respect for Robin Kelly, but I want to be careful with that one. I'd hate to have to tell the surviving World War II veterans that there shouldn't be any memorial to them at D-Day.
Yeah.
Or the Shaw Memorial. I'm sorry. It's military, but by God,
those people fought for something. I mean, they fought for something that we value, and they sacrificed in ways that we aren't. And thank God we don't have to sacrifice. I would not want them to be forgotten.
Well, and a key point here too is that historically, monument making came out of the Romantic age. At least the monuments we know of, where the individual hero is always exalted. And in the 19th century, the measure of every sculptor was whether he or she could do an equestrian.
Yeah,
that was the measure. Could you do an equestrian? Which is the way St. Gaudens started out with the Shaw Memorial and ended up putting the soldiers there. Anyway, so this exaltation of the romantic individual hero. There always had to be an individual. But why not a national monument to the natural rights tradition? Annette? I mean, the American Republic is born out of this thing Jefferson called natural rights. I mean, let's inspire some really creative artists to go after that. How about popular sovereignty? How about a monument to equality? Well, we could say every civil rights monument is a monument to equality. It is. But maybe we do need to inspire artists now, or maybe they already are inspired. Maybe they need to tell us.
And moving away from people as the embodiment of these things, because people, that's why you don't name things after people who are still alive, because you don't know what they're going to do. And now we know they're historical figures. We know the things they did, and we want to say, oh, let's get rid of that.
As Jim said, these people lived 60, 70 years of an adult life, and they were human beings, and they might have done some awful things, as well as that one thing that was heroic that we're recognizing them for.
Exactly. No, I was talking to somebody the other day and said, if you gave, for anybody that you have, if you gave us historians a week, we could probably wreck that person.
Any university more than 100 years old has got a problem somewhere.
Yeah. I want to say, let me say, I don't want to minimize slavery as a thing that a person did.
No.
But the point is, as I was suggesting before, and this is looking at it as the way we look at things historically, it's very, very hard to have a person, anybody who's not going to have something that people will find revolting or repulsive about them. Keep looking at it.
And I think that's really important. There's a lot of the questions that we're getting relate to education and young people. And it does seem to me that what you're saying is that one of the values of learning history is that humility, right? That this recognition that very few people go through their lives purely heroic. Some do go through purely villainous. We have statues of those people.
Yeah.
Unredeemable.
Unredeemable. But who is that should be an aspect that should be an aspect of humility that kids can learn by learning history.
Mhm. And having a relationship to people that is, well, this is a value judgment on my part, that is proper, not to think that you can admire people and for what they did, but this notion, it's almost like Hollywood, how the Dream Factory made us think that, it's not enough to go watch somebody on the screen. You have to know all about their private lives. You have to identify with them, so much so that people had to lie about who they were to sort of keep this thing going. But, you don't, you have a personal relationship with the people that you actually know in your lives, and you have a stake in those people, maybe changing how you view what your connection is to the person, to look at what they did, but to say not all into them in the sense that this is me and I identify with them and I'm pretending that I'm them or whatever. A healthy skepticism about everybody, and a detachment is the word I'm looking for here, about the figures who are on the public stage, who did things that are important, but they're not gods, and you shouldn't think that, you're measuring yourself as them or by them.
So
Jim, well,
yeah, go ahead, David.
Well,
I was going to say, this comes often with school naming, right?
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
And so are you suggesting that maybe when schools have names, usually the students at some point while they're students have to learn why the school was named after that person, and that person becomes, in a sense, the kind of role model you were describing, Annette?
Yeah.
Should we be suggesting that every curriculum should include a critique of the person for whom the school is named, no matter who it is?
Well, almost you have to, don't you? There was a place in Texas that I think decided, I'm forgetting now where it was, decided to change all the Stonewall Jacksons and the Robert E. Lees to names from nature. And the only safe way to go, get off people, birds, nature, why not? Street names, same thing. I was just going to say, Jim, real quickly, after the Charleston massacre in 15, and then after Charlottesville in 17, and all of us were out at all these gatherings and panels about memory and monuments and so on, I decided I would go to every audience with 3 principles. And I didn't always get very far with this, and I won't now either. One principle was you had to have a deliberative process. Deliberative process. The second was you had to go learn some more history first. Always hard. And the third was learn some humility from the process. Now that sounded so school marmish and scolding that it didn't always work, but it seems to me it's still important. If we're not deliberative about this, if we don't learn the history behind how did this monument ever get here, and we don't gain a little humility about human nature out of this, then the exercise might be futile.
Yeah, I think that's right. These are people, and we're
humility is not in vogue, though. Have you noticed that?
You know what? It's 1:30. It's 1:30. It's time to go. You guys are busy, and I'm okay with ending on the relationship between humility and human nature as an argument for why everybody should study history, and why history should remain a central place in the curriculum, which is an important thing to remind people right now. So thank you very much. And we'll be back with everybody another time.
Yeah, lots of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annette. Take care of yourself.
Okay, bye-bye. You too.
Bye-bye.